Good morning and welcome to Oldham St Andrews for the sermon for Sunday the 24th of October, based on Job chapter 42. Life goes on. Life turned upside down. I wasn't around during the war, the Second World War I mean, though there have been conflicts involving our armed forces for all but just a handful of years throughout my lifetime. So I guess, like many people, there have been plenty of strife around while I've been alive. But thinking back to those who came through the dark days of the Second World War, and especially the earlier years when threat of invasion was very real, though how much of that was apparent to children, I wonder, I can't help speculating about how the strife, suffering, restrictions, pressures, and impact on life generally COVID has in the last 18 months compared to then. Perhaps that's a topic of conversation we might explore, though I suspect thoughts will differ depending on a person's particular experience. One thing is for sure. Things have been tough for most people and desperate for quite a few. As well as the direct effects, there have been more uncertainty than most of us have experienced or even thought possible. And it still isn't over. No doubt there will be fallout for years to come. Without raking over old ground, can we acknowledge then that all of us have been through the mill to some extent? While the details will differ and the extent to which we have coped will vary, things have been tough, and in ways that we would never have thought possible 2 years ago. We've had a glimpse at the sufferings of Job over the past few weeks. We've heard of his woes and perhaps sympathised with him as his well-meaning friends offered him less than satisfactory platitudes. We got a sense of the deep agony he felt, not only in the very real losses he experienced, but also in the darkest times when he couldn't sense God's presence, when he began to wonder whether God had washed his hands of him. Perhaps we marvelled at how Job held on to his faith, hope against hope. And though our suffering, our losses, our feeling aggrieved at how much our world has been turned upside down is so very different from Job's on the surface, we actually have more in common than we might think. How many of us have asked, "Why did you allow this to happen? What have I done to deserve this? Where have you been when my life, when the world was turned upside down, when we were put through the ringer, and for what?" And maybe amidst some times of comfort and encouragement and sense of God's presence, there have been times for you when prayer has been nigh on impossible, when struggling to hold on to the faith has seemed like you're wading through mud, and when it can be so hard to think much past the next few days, and when hope for a real and better future is almost a pipe dream, much as though we would want it to be otherwise. So, is life all doom and gloom? Is the book of Job one of misery and disaster? Suffering certainly to the fore, and is real, that's for sure. And we need to allow ourselves time to accept our suffering, to process the grief and agony in our individual lives, and also to make space for national and international grieving and the world's suffering. We can't simply pick ourselves up, brush ourselves down, and get on with things as though nothing has happened. Society accepts that when we are desperately ill or when we are bereaved, it is normal to show sorrow and humanity, to grieve and be not ourselves for a time. Even this materially orientated 21st century society can take account of that, giving us a bit of time and space to come to ourselves, to weep, to reflect, to recalibrate. And that is something we must all do, individually and collectively, for COVID has turned our world upside down. And much as though we would want everything to return to normal, it won't ever be the same. We won't be the same. Getting closure. Job had been through the mill, and here at the end of a very long book and a saga of life-changing suffering, of spiritual as well as human trauma, Job begins to emerge and face his new reality. He'd had his moans and rants at God. His faith had taken a real beating, but he held firm, even in the face of unexpected answers when God had challenged Job to see his own lowly place in the universe when compared to the majesty and glory of creation and of God himself. Job readily acknowledged his place. Many would have moaned further and clamoured for some apology from God, or else wallowed in self-pity. But that was not for Job, and it is to his credit that he held firm. Of course, you could argue that even that was a sign of God's grace and keeping, proof positive that God's hold on him was firm and immovable, which is true, but nevertheless, humanly speaking, well done, Job. But while the closing verses of the book might be summarised as, "and he lived happily ever after," there's more to it than that. Yes, the final verses point to a restoration of Job to family and fortune, but can we really pretend that everything was back to normal, or even better than they had been? Job did get closure, or at least was in the process of getting it. First and foremost, he was reconciled to God, restored to a life and vibrant relationship with him, and he was seen to be in the right with God in face of his doubting friends and the wider society. For the tongues had been wagging, the fingers had been pointing throughout his suffering, and in his dark times, distanced from God. Without doubt, neighbours would have been doubting him, suggesting that Job, the righteous, had fallen foul of the Almighty through some fault of his own, even if they couldn't exactly put their finger on it. Mark my words, there's no smoke without fire. But Job was shown to be in step with God, and that must have counted for a lot. But he still had a lot to process. I can't believe for a moment that he could simply have dismissed his times of deep darkness and suffering. No matter what the exact duration, it must have seemed like an eternity. God was there, he would be there, and there would be plenty of time to ask more searching questions and explore why all that had happened. It doesn't do to rush. But as well as that, there wouldn't be a turning back of the clock to how things used to be. Normal going forward was not the same as normal had been before his woes. Job was a changed person. He was different. His outlook on life was bound to have been altered. Perhaps he treasured his loved ones even more. Was his relationship with God deeper, more reverential, less assumed, less taken for granted? Any suggestion that he could merely shrug off his trauma fails to recognise the depth of his trauma, just how wounded he was. So yes, the closing verses of the book signal a restoration of Job's fortunes and of his justification before God. But this is not Hans Christian Andersen. It's not a fairy tale, and life isn't a fairy tale for us. Job's initial restoration most likely was followed by years of coming to terms with everything that had happened to him, getting closure while enjoying the love and support of a growing family, and from all accounts an ever-deepening relationship with God. But this was not the same Job as before. The Job of chapter 42 was a man who had been through the mill, who'd undergone grievous loss, who'd had his faith called into question, who'd experienced the dark night of the soul. He carried the scars of life's hard knocks, albeit they were receiving the balm of God's love. But that didn't make him any less a person, nor any less a servant of God. It was who he was. It was part of what God had made him, and he would take that forward with him wherever he went. Our closure. And so it is for us. Not that our story or our future will be a carbon copy of Job's. We're not his clone. Life does go on, but not in the sense of as usual. Our lives have been affected to some degree or other this past year and a half, especially, and also by every hard knock that we've experienced throughout our lives. We can turn the clock back an hour each autumn, but we can't turn the clock back and erase our sufferings and loss. We must learn to live with them, or at least with their consequences. And God can help us with that. We need to give ourselves and one another time. Just because everyone experienced something of COVID and its consequences doesn't mean that it is any less traumatic. We can't simply pretend that life going forward will be as it was before. It won't, and some fallout is likely to be with us for years, and not always showing itself in ways we might have imagined. We need time to process our losses, our upsets, maybe our sense of being robbed of life as we knew it. We can work towards getting to grips with a new reality, including the impact COVID has had on our relationships, our faith, the church, the economy, as well as our own health and the health service. God is not going to banish our woes or wave a spiritual wand to remove all that has harmed us and grant us a trouble-free fantasy life of luxury. God operates in the real world, but he loves us in this ever-changing, imperfect, and sometimes very broken world. As Jesus said, "I will be with you always to the end of the age." And he will, even and especially when things are broken and bumpy. Hold firm. I have redeemed you. You are mine. Thank you for joining us. May the Lord bless you. Amen.